Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. The lighthouse keeper's log. The first time I saw the ship, I thought it was a hallucination. 3 months alone on this godforsaken rock will do that to you, make you see things that aren't there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I've been the keeper of the Widow's Point Lighthouse for 7 months now. Before that, I was a merchant marine for 20 years until anxiety and insomnia made me unfit for deep-sea voyages. The lighthouse service seemed perfect: solitude, routine, and purpose. I maintained the light that kept ships from the treacherous rocks surrounding our little peninsula, and in return I'd get peace and quiet. The lighthouse stands on a narrow spit of land jutting into the North Atlantic. The nearest town, Coldport, is 15 miles away. Supply boats come once a month, weather permitting. Otherwise, it's just me, the gulls, and the endless symphony of waves against rock. The previous keeper, old Malcolm Reed, had manned this post for 37 years. When I took over, he gave me a brief tour, showed me the machinery, the living quarters, and the logbook. "Write everything down," he told me, his rheumy eyes serious beneath bushy white brows. "Weather conditions, ship sightings, maintenance, everything." I nodded, thinking it standard procedure. "And Thomas," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, "if you see anything unusual, record that too, but keep those entries separate." I laughed, thinking he was pulling the new guy's leg. "Unusual like what? Mermaids?" "Sea monsters." Malcolm didn't smile. "Just keep a separate log." I dismissed his warning as the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too long in isolation. Now, I understand he was trying to prepare me. The first 3 months were uneventful. I settled into my routine: wake at dawn, check the weather, perform maintenance, polish the brass, clean the lens, and most importantly, ensure the light remained operational from dusk till dawn. I kept meticulous records in the official logbook. The solitude suited me. My anxiety eased in the absence of human interaction. I read books, listened to music on my portable player, and took long walks along the shoreline when weather permitted. At night, I'd sit in the watchroom beneath the lantern, drinking tea and watching the beams sweep across the dark waters. It was during one such night in late October when I first saw it. The weather had been foul for days, driving rain and howling winds that made the lighthouse shudder. But that evening, the storm abruptly ceased. The clouds parted, revealing a full moon that cast an eerie silver path across the black water. The sudden silence was almost unnerving after days of tempest. I was in the watch room, recording the weather change in my log, when movement on the water caught my eye. A ship was approaching from the northeast, moving parallel to the shore. This wasn't unusual in itself. Vessels passed by regularly, though most were too far out to see clearly without binoculars. What struck me as odd was the ship's appearance. Even at a distance, I could tell it was old, not vintage or classic, but anachronistic. It appeared to be a three-masted bark, the kind that hadn't been in common use for a century. Its sails were full despite the lack of wind, and it moved with unnatural speed. I grabbed my binoculars for a closer look. The vessel was indeed an old sailing ship, its wooden hull weathered and dark. No running lights were visible, and I could make out no crew on deck. As it passed within a mile of the lighthouse, I noticed the name painted on its bow: Lady Eliza. I recorded the sighting in my logbook, noting the time, 11:42 p.m., and the unusual nature of the vessel. Then, remembering Malcolm's words, I opened a drawer and took out a small, leather-bound journal I'd bought in town but hadn't yet used. In it, I made a more detailed entry about the strange ship. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd been tired and had misjudged the vessel's appearance. Perhaps it was a replica, a historical recreation for tourists or film. I called the Coast Guard on my radio to inquire about any tall ships in the area. "Negative, Widow's Point," came the response. "No sailing vessels registered within 50 miles of your position last night." I let it go, chalking it up to fatigue and isolation playing tricks on my perception. But a week later, I saw it again. This time it was just after sunset. The sky was clear, stars beginning to emerge in the deepening blue. I was outside, on the gallery that circled the lantern room, having just lit the light for the night. The Lady Eliza appeared from the same direction as before, silent and swift, its dark sails catching no light. It passed closer to shore this time, and through my binoculars I could see that the deck was not, as I'd first thought, empty. Figures moved aboard the ship, indistinct shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk. I couldn't make out features, just dark silhouettes against the weathered deck. As I watched, one figure separated from the others and moved to the railing. It seemed to look directly at the lighthouse, at me. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. The figure raised an arm, a clear gesture of acknowledgement. Without thinking, I raised my own hand in response. Immediately, I regretted it. The figure remained motionless for several seconds, then turned and rejoined the others. The ship continued on its course, disappearing around the point to the southwest. I hurried inside and made another entry in my secret log, hands shaking slightly as I wrote. That night I dreamed of the Lady Eliza. In my dream I stood on its deck, surrounded by the crew, men with pale, gaunt faces and hollow eyes. They didn't speak, just watched me with expressions of infinite sadness. At the helm stood a woman in a long, dark dress, her face obscured by a veil. When I approached her, she turned, and I woke with a strangled cry, the details of her face already fading from memory. The next day I decided to research the Lady Eliza. The lighthouse had a small collection of books, including some on local maritime history. I spent hours poring over them but found no mention of a ship by that name. The lighthouse's internet connection was unreliable at best, but I managed to search online archives of shipwrecks and vessel registries. Again, nothing. It was while replacing the books on the shelf that I noticed a thin volume wedged behind the others. It was bound in faded blue cloth, its pages yellowed with age. The title, stamped in tarnished gold on the spine, read, Notable Maritime Disasters of New England, 1850–1900. I flipped through it idly, not expecting to find anything relevant. But there, on page 73, was a brief entry that made my blood run cold. Lady Eliza, bark, 1873. Lost with all hands during the Great Gale of November 1894. Captain Jeremiah Marsh, crew of 12 and 1 passenger. Wreckage found near Widow's Point, no survivors. The passenger was listed as Elizabeth Marsh, wife of the captain. I sat motionless, the book open in my hands. A ship that had sunk over a century ago was sailing past my lighthouse. I told myself there must be an explanation, a different ship with the same name, perhaps, but deep down I knew what I'd seen. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the watch room, eyes fixed on the dark waters, half hoping and half fearing I would see the Lady Eliza again. Around midnight my radio crackled to life. Widow's Point Lighthouse, this is the fishing vessel Northern Star. Do you copy? Over. I grabbed the handset. This is Widow's Point. I read you Northern Star. Over. We're about 3 miles off your position, heading south. Just wanted to verify your light is operational. It seems to be. Flickering from our vantage. Over. I frowned. The light was working perfectly when I'd checked it at sunset. Stand by, Northern Star. Let me check the lantern. I hurried up the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The massive Fresnel lens was indeed functioning normally, rotating steadily, the light bright and constant. I returned to the radio. Northern Star, this is Widow's Point. The light is operating at full capacity. No flickering observed. Over. There was a pause before the response came. That's strange. From here it definitely appears to be dimming intermittently. Are you sure everything's normal? Over. Positive, I replied, unease growing in my gut. But I'll keep a close watch on it. What's your current position exactly? Over. We're at. The transmission dissolved into static. Northern Star, please repeat. You're breaking up. Over. More static than a fragment. See it now. That's not. Jesus Christ, what is that ship? My heart began to pound. Northern Star, do you copy? What ship? Over. The radio emitted a high-pitched whine, then silence. I called repeatedly but received no response. Grabbing my binoculars, I raced back up to the gallery and scanned the dark waters. At first I saw nothing. Then, a flicker of light about where the Northern Star should be. As I watched, the light grew brighter flames. I realized with horror. A ship was burning. I ran back to the radio and issued an emergency call to the Coast Guard, reporting a vessel in distress. They acknowledged and dispatched a rescue boat, but it would take at least an hour to reach the scene. I returned to the gallery with the binoculars. The burning ship was now clearly visible, a horrific beacon in the night. But as I watched, I noticed another vessel near it, a dark shape with tall masts, the Lady Eliza. The sailing ship circled the burning fishing boat slowly, like a shark around wounded prey. I could see no attempt at rescue. Indeed, it seemed as if the Lady Eliza was simply waiting. As the flames on the Northern Star grew higher, the sailing ship drew closer. Then something impossible happened. The fire on the fishing vessel suddenly extinguished, as if doused by an invisible wave. In the darkness that followed, I could just make out small shapes, people, I assumed, moving from the Northern Star to the Lady Eliza. The transfer took only minutes. Then the sailing ship turned and began moving away, leaving the dark hulk of the fishing vessel behind. I watched, transfixed, as the Lady Eliza sailed directly toward the lighthouse. It came closer than ever before, close enough that I could see figures lining the rail. They were looking up at me, their faces pale smudges in the darkness. At the bow stood a woman in a long dress, her hair streaming behind her in a wind I couldn't feel. As the ship passed beneath the lighthouse, the light above me suddenly went out. The mechanism continued to rotate. I could hear its familiar hum, but no beam emerged to sweep across the water. The Lady Eliza and the distant, dark shape of the Northern Star were swallowed by the absolute darkness. I fumbled my way inside and down to the service room, where the emergency systems were located. The backup generator kicked in, but the light remained dark. All the indicators showed it should be working, yet no light shone. I worked frantically, checking connections, testing circuits, but found nothing wrong. Then as suddenly as it had failed, the light blazed back to life. I ran back to the gallery, but both ships had vanished. The sea was empty, peaceful under the cold stars. The Coast Guard arrived an hour later, but found no trace of the Northern Star or its crew. No debris, no oil slick, no emergency beacons. According to their records, no vessel by that name had been registered in any New England port for the past decade. I didn't tell them about the Lady Eliza. How could I? Instead, I reported hearing a distress call and seeing what looked like a ship on fire. They took my statement, searched the area thoroughly, and eventually concluded I had either imagined it or seen something else, perhaps a flare or lights from another vessel that I'd misinterpreted. After they left, I made a detailed entry in my secret log. Then I did something I'd never done before. I took a bottle of whiskey from my personal stores and drank until I passed out. The next morning, I called my supervisor at the Lighthouse Authority and requested an immediate transfer or, failing that, some company at the station. I cited safety concerns following the mysterious incident. He was sympathetic but explained that no replacements or assistants were available for at least 2 months. I would have to hold my position until then. I considered simply leaving, packing my things, and walking to town if necessary. But that would mean abandoning my post, leaving ships vulnerable to the treacherous rocks. Whatever was happening, I couldn't justify endangering innocent lives, so I stayed, but I made changes. I began keeping the radio on at all times, tuned to the emergency channel. I set up a small cot in the watch room so I could sleep where I could see the water. And I started recording everything on my phone, the normal operation of the light, the empty seas, my own daily routines, as if documenting the mundane could somehow keep the inexplicable at bay. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual happened. No sign of the Lady Eliza, no mysterious radio calls, no light malfunctions. I began to hope that whatever strange phenomenon I'd experienced had passed. Then came the fog. It rolled in one afternoon, unusually thick and cold for the season. Within hours, visibility dropped to near zero. The lighthouse's fog horn activated automatically, its mournful blast sounding every 30 seconds. I checked and double-checked the light, ensuring it was at maximum brightness to penetrate the murk. As dusk approached, the temperature dropped sharply. The fog took on an eerie luminescence, glowing faintly as if lit from within. I stood in the watch room, staring out at the white void, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me from within that blank canvas. The radio crackled. At first, I thought it was just static, the result of atmospheric conditions. But then I heard it, a voice faint and distorted. "Help us, we are lost." I grabbed the handset. "This is Widow's Point Lighthouse. Identify yourself and your position. Over." The response came through a wash of static. Cannot see. The light is wrong. Elizabeth, please." A chill ran through me. "What is your vessel name?" Over. "The Lady. We are foundering. The rocks." The transmission cut off abruptly. I tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, but received no response. The emergency channel remained silent except for routine Coast Guard broadcasts. I considered calling in the distress signal, but hesitated. What if this was connected to the Northern Star incident? The Coast Guard had found nothing then. They'd likely think I was becoming unhinged now. Instead, I took my heaviest coat and a powerful flashlight and made my way down to the base of the lighthouse. The fog was so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The beam of my flashlight seemed to terminate just feet ahead, absorbed by the white mist. The fog horn sounded above me, so loud at this proximity that I felt it in my chest. Between blasts, I could hear the sea churning against the rocks below, unseen but terrifyingly close. "Hello," I called out. "Is anyone there?" My voice sounded muffled, as if the fog itself were swallowing the sound. I moved carefully along the narrow path that circled the lighthouse base, one hand on the stone wall for guidance. I'm not sure how long I walked or how many times I circled the lighthouse. The fog disoriented me, and the constant blare of the horn made it hard to think. Eventually, I reached the small dock where supply boats moored. The wooden planks were slick with moisture, and I moved cautiously to the end, playing my flashlight over the heaving water below. That's when I heard it, a different sound beneath the crash of waves and blare of the horn, a creaking, wooden sound, the sound of a ship. I swung my flashlight out over the water, but the beam disappeared into the fog without illuminating anything. The creaking grew louder, and with it came voices, indistinct at first, then clearer. Men shouting orders, the sound of running feet on wooden decks. "Hello," I called again. "Do you need assistance?" The noises stopped abruptly. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against me like a physical presence. Then a voice spoke directly beside me. "The light is wrong, Thomas." I whirled around, nearly losing my footing on the slippery dock. A woman stood there, her figure indistinct in the fog. She wore a long, dark dress, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the flashlight's beam. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. "Elizabeth Marsh," she said, her voice as cold as the fog surrounding us. "You must fix the light, Thomas." "It's leading them astray. The light is working perfectly," I said, taking an involuntary step backward. She shook her head slowly. "No, it shows the way to safety, but they need to come to us. They all need to come to us." "Who? Who needs to come to you?" Elizabeth's eyes, which had been fixed on mine, suddenly looked past me, out to sea. "They're coming now." I turned to follow her gaze. Through the fog, I could make out lights, the running lights of a modern vessel, approaching the lighthouse from the northeast. "No," I said, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. "The light is meant to warn them away from the rocks. The rocks are their salvation," Elizabeth whispered. "As they were ours." I ran back up the path, slipping on wet stone, heart pounding in my chest. I had to reach the lighthouse, had to make sure the light was working properly. Behind me, I heard Elizabeth's voice, no longer beside me, but seemingly everywhere at once. "You cannot stop it, Thomas. The Lady Eliza must have her crew." I burst through the lighthouse door and took the stairs 2 at a time, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I climbed, I became aware of another sound beneath my footfalls and labored breathing, the creaking of wood, as if the stone tower had become a ship's mast straining in high winds. When I reached the lantern room, what I saw stopped me cold. The light was still turning, still blazing bright, but it was no longer white. The beam that swept out into the fog was a sickly green, the color of sea rot and drowning. I rushed to the control panel and tried to shut it down, to reset the system, but nothing responded to my commands. The green light continued to rotate, painting the fog outside with its ghastly hue. Through the windows, I could see the approaching ship more clearly now. It was a container vessel, massive and modern, its lights cutting weakly through the fog. It was heading directly toward the rocky point, directly toward destruction. I grabbed the radio and broadcast an emergency warning. "Attention vessel approaching Widow's Point. This is the lighthouse keeper. You are on a collision course with the rocks. Do not trust the light." "Repeat, do not trust the light." Only static answered me. I tried again and again, switching frequencies, increasing volume, but could not make contact. The ship drew closer, seemingly unaware of the danger. In desperation, I took the emergency flare gun from its cabinet and ran out onto the gallery. The fog swirled around me, thick as soup, but illuminated now by that terrible green light. I fired a flare high into the air, its red brilliance momentarily cutting through the murk. For a moment I thought it had worked. The container ship's horn sounded one long blast, and it began to turn. But then I saw the other ship emerging from the fog on the vessel's starboard side. The Lady Eliza, its dark sails full, moving with impossible speed on a collision course. "No," I screamed, though I knew they couldn't hear me. The Lady Eliza struck the container ship amidships. But instead of the crash of impact, there was a different sound, a horrible rushing noise, like water flooding into a breached hull. The container ship listed sharply, its lights flickering. And then, impossibly, the Lady Eliza began to pass through the larger vessel, like a ghost through a wall. As it did, lights on the container ship winked out one by one, until it was as dark as the sailing ship that had impaled it. I stood frozen, watching the impossible unfold. When the Lady Eliza had passed completely through, the container ship righted itself. But it was changed. Its sleek modern lines had become somehow indistinct, its solid form less substantial. It turned, following in the wake of the sailing ship, both vessels now heading away from the lighthouse. As they disappeared into the fog, the green light above me returned to its normal white brilliance. The fog began to dissipate, revealing a calm sea under a star-filled sky. No ships, no wreckage, nothing to suggest what I had just witnessed. I spent the rest of the night in the watch room, radio in hand, calling for the container ship, calling for any vessels in the area, calling for the Coast Guard. No one had seen anything. No ships were reported missing. According to all official channels, nothing unusual had happened near Widow's Point that night. In the morning, I made a final entry in my secret log, then packed it with my few personal belongings. I left the official logbook open on the desk, my final entry reading simply, "Light functioning normally. No vessels sighted. Signing off, Thomas Blackwood." I left the lighthouse that day, walking the 15 miles to Coldport along the coastal road. I never returned, never explained my abandonment of my post. The lighthouse authority fired me, of course, and I made no appeal. Let them think me irresponsible or cowardly. The truth was far worse. I live in a small inland town now, as far from the sea as I could manage. I don't sleep well. In my dreams, I'm back in the lighthouse, watching the Lady Eliza claim ship after ship, crew after crew. Sometimes Elizabeth Marsh is there, standing beside me, her cold hand on my arm, thanking me for my service. "The light is right now, Thomas," she says. "It brings them all to us. Last week I received a small package. No return address, just my name and current location. Inside was a newspaper clipping about the appointment of a new keeper at Widow's Point Lighthouse. There was a photo, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, standing before the white tower. And behind him, just visible through the window of the lantern room, a pale face watching, a woman in a dark dress. I burned the clipping, but it doesn't matter. I know what's happening at Widow's Point. I know ships are disappearing without distress calls, without debris, without explanation. And I know that somewhere on the dark Atlantic, the Lady Eliza sails on, her ghostly crew growing with each passing night, her holds filled with the souls of the drowned. The light is wrong, you see, it always was.